Somewhere beyond the northern mountains, beyond the edge of New Austin, and beyond every road that Arthur Morgan or John Marston ever followed, there is an unwritten frontier. It has no official map. It has no announced hero, no release date, and not even a confirmed title. Yet people have been living in that frontier for years. They have imagined campfires there, placed old gunslingers beside them, and argued over which direction the morning sun ought to rise. Red Dead Redemption 3 does not officially exist, but the idea of it has already gathered a history of its own. Every unfinished sentence in the first two games has become a possible opening scene. Every vanished character has become a possible protagonist. Every blank region beyond the map has become a country waiting to be crossed. Tonight, we are going to travel through that imaginary country slowly. We will begin with what Rockstar has actually said, then move outward into the theories built by players. Jack Marston after 1914, Sadie Adler in South America, Charles Smith in Canada, the Calendar Brothers before Blackwater, Landon Ricketts in the true age of gunslingers, and a younger Dutch and Hosea before their dream began to rot. We will also reach the stranger trails, where Red Harlow becomes uncle, the strange man waits at the center of the story, and a book in another Rockstar game is treated as evidence that Jack survived long enough to become an author. Some of these roads are sturdy, some disappear after a mile. All of them tell us something about what people still want from Red Dead. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the country open at its own pace. If these long journeys through game worlds help make the night quieter, you can leave a like or subscribe before the trail carries us too far from camp. There will be no need to remember every rumor. The important distinctions will stay clear as we go. What the games establish, what the people who made them have suggested, and what fans have built in the beautiful silence between official answers. The first truth is simple enough to say, and important enough to repeat only once. Rockstar Games has not announced Red Dead Redemption 3. There is no verified trailer, casting sheet, map, plot description, or launch window. Current Rockstar announcements remain centered on Grand Theft Auto 6, GTA Online, and recurring Red Dead Online events. That does not prove that nobody inside the company has ever discussed another Red Dead. Large games can exist as conversations, experiments, private documents, and small pre-production teams long before the public sees a logo. It does mean that every confident post claiming to know the hero, year, or location is moving beyond evidence. The frontier is open because the official page is blank. Commercial logic is the strongest reason to believe the blank page will not remain blank forever. Red Dead Redemption 2 became one of the most successful premium games ever released. Take-Two continues to identify it as a major contributor years after launch, while Rockstar still promotes Red Dead Online and has brought the original Red Dead Redemption to newer platforms. A company does not need sentiment to recognize the value of a name that can command this much attention. Yet commercial certainty cannot choose a story. It can tell us why another journey is likely. It cannot tell us whether that journey begins in 1865, 1914, Mexico, Canada, or a town that has never appeared on a map. Dan Houser offered the most interesting public complication. As one of Rockstar's founders and a central writer on both Redemption games, he has said that another Red Dead will probably happen, while also describing the existing pair as a cohesive two-game arc. His sadness at the possibility is not a warning that a sequel would be bad. It is the feeling of seeing a completed work continued by others after leaving the company. Arthur's story flows into John's, and John's flows into Jack's final act. That chain has a beginning, middle, and bitter ending. A third numbered game would therefore face a question before it chose a single horse. Should it extend that chain, explain what came before it, or leave it alone and find a different family? Roger Clark has drawn a similar boundary around Arthur Morgan. He has expressed confidence that another Red Dead will arrive someday, but he has also said that Arthur's story has been told. That matters because one of the easiest rumors to spread is the promise of a beloved character returning. Arthur can appear in memories, photographs, an epilogue, or the younger years of the gang, without being resurrected or given a secret survival. His death is not an inconvenience for a sequel to solve. It is the point toward which his entire life bends. Any theory that brings him back after 1899 has to damage the meaning of the second game before it can begin the third. The secrecy surrounding Rockstar makes weak evidence look stronger than it is. An actor posts a photograph in Western clothing, and people see a costume test. A performer mentions an exciting project, and the word exciting becomes a coded message. Someone adds an unexplained credit to a professional profile, and a logo appears in a thumbnail by evening. Benjamin Byron Davis, who played Dutch, has described how little performers themselves could know. Rockstar once checked his availability long before he understood what project was coming. In such a system, silence from an actor proves nothing, but a wink from an actor may prove just as little. The people closest to the work can be contractually quiet, deliberately misdirected, or genuinely unaware of the whole. That is why the recent bursts of excitement around actors asking to be cowboys should be enjoyed as enthusiasm, not decoded as prophecy. A public joke can spark thousands of casting suggestions because Red Dead has made the Western feel like one of the rare game worlds where a performance can live for decades. Fans are not foolish for noticing. They are responding to a company famous for hiding its projects. But secrecy creates an unusual trap. Because real information is concealed, any information can dress itself as real. The safest approach is to ask whether a rumor contains evidence that could not have been produced by an ordinary fan. Most do not. Even the name Red Dead Redemption 3 is a theory. The series began with Red Dead Revolver, then moved into a separate continuity and a different tone with Redemption. A future Western could keep the Red Dead name while changing the final word. Fans have proposed Revolution, Revenge, Reckoning, Rebellion, Requiem, and several other titles that preserve the initials. Most of those names reveal a desired plot more than an actual prediction. Revolution points toward Mexico or Javier Escuella. Revenge suggests Sadie, Jack, or the beginning of the Dutch-Colm feud. Requiem imagines a final farewell to the old cast. The names are attractive because a subtitle can free the next game from the obligation to repeat Redemption as a moral shape. Keeping Redemption would be understandable for the opposite reason. It is no longer only a theme. It is the recognizable identity of Rockstar's Western world. Arthur and John do not experience identical redemptions, and a new person could find another form, refusing vengeance, protecting a community, confessing a crime, breaking a family pattern, or accepting the consequences of violence without pretending those consequences erase the past. The word is broad enough to survive a new cast. What it cannot survive forever is a mechanical formula in which every hero contracts an illness, rescues a successor, and dies on a mountain. The third game would need the moral rhythm of redemption, without tracing Arthur's footprints exactly. The theory that moves furthest forward begins with Jack Marston standing over Edgar Ross in 1914. John has already been killed by the government he served. Abigail has died. Uncle is gone. The ranch that represented the family's escape has become a place full of graves. Jack finds Ross in retirement and shoots him beside the San Luis River, completing the revenge that John spent his final years trying to prevent. It is a fierce ending because Jack looks capable, composed, and terribly alone. A chronological sequel could begin the moment the gun smoke clears. Instead of asking whether Jack can avenge his father, it could ask whether he can live with having done it. Supporters of the Jack theory see an unfinished redemption in that moment. Jack has inherited every lesson the adults tried to spare him. Dutch taught the gang to answer authority with violence. Arthur learned too late that love sometimes means helping another person leave. John built a home but returned for Micah, allowing revenge to expose him to Ross. Jack then repeats John's mistake with greater finality. A third game could give him one last chance to break the pattern. He might flee the Bureau, protect a family of his own, or choose not to pull the trigger when history places another Ross in front of him. The emotional material is already present. The difficulty is the calendar. In 1914, the frontier is no longer dying quietly. It has entered another age. Cars, telephones, federal policing, automatic weapons, and industrial cities would become more prominent. Europe is moving into the First World War. The United States will follow in 1917. A Jack sequel can remain rural for a while, particularly along the Mexican border, but every year takes it farther from the landscape that defines Red Dead. The first game deliberately ends in 1914 because the Old West has reached its grave. Continuing forward risks turning a Western tragedy into a crime story wearing its father's hat. One branch sends Jack into the First World War. His age makes service plausible, and the idea has a sharp historical cruelty. John wanted his son to become educated, perhaps a lawyer or writer, not a gunman. The government that destroyed John's family might then put Jack in uniform and send him across an ocean to kill strangers. Trenches could give his inherited talent for violence a terrible official purpose. Letters, photographs, and memories of Beecher's hope might carry the quieter part of the story. Yet the farther Jack travels into European battlefields, the less the game resembles Red Dead. Horses would still be present, but the open world would be replaced by organized war. It is a powerful chapter in an imagined life, and a poor foundation for the Western freedom people expect. Another branch waits until Prohibition. Jack returns from war, or simply survives into the 1920s, and becomes a bootlegger moving liquor across the border. Horses share roads with cars. Ranches sit beside oil fields. Small gangs feed growing criminal networks in cities. The Marston name becomes part of the gangster age, and the series completes its movement from outlaw camp to modern organized crime. The transition has thematic elegance. It also places Red Dead beside Mafia, LA Noire, and Grand Theft Auto. The closer Jack gets to Tommy guns and urban rackets, the harder it becomes to justify using Rockstar's Western series instead of building a different crime game. Mexico offers Jack a quieter escape from that problem. After killing Ross, he could cross the river and vanish into a country already transformed by revolution. Red Dead Redemption leaves Mexico in political turmoil. and the wider Mexican Revolution continues well beyond 1911. Jack speaks some Spanish, knows the borderlands, and has no reason to trust American institutions. A story there could preserve horses, rural settlements, armed factions, and unstable authority. It might also force Jack to recognize that another country's struggle is not a stage for his private grief. Used carefully, Mexico could turn him from a lonely avenger into someone who chooses a cause or finally refuses one. The gentlest Jack theory does not require an action sequel at all. It imagines him surviving, laying down the gun, and becoming the writer his parents hoped he might be. A book called Red Dead by Jack Marston can be found as an Easter egg in Grand Theft Auto 5, and fans have built an entire future from that small object. Perhaps Jack gathers Arthur's journals, remembers John's stories, and writes the saga we have been experiencing. The games then become his attempt to preserve people the official history would call criminals and forget. Arthur's intimate sketches explain the texture. Jack's distance explains the myth. It is a lovely piece of headcanon, but the book is not firm proof. Rockstar's games exchange brands, names, objects, and jokes without always sharing one literal universe. Red Dead uses real places such as New York and California, while Grand Theft Auto replaces them with Liberty City and San Andreas. A shelf prop can honor a character without opening a secret tunnel between continuities. More importantly, the author theory resolves Jack's life too neatly. The possibility that he writes is moving precisely because nobody confirms it. Turning that hope into a full game might make the mystery smaller. Jack remains the cleanest sequel on a family tree, and one of the hardest sequels in genre. His story can continue, but the West cannot. That tension explains why people keep returning to him. He is both the last available branch of the Marston line and evidence that the line should end. A short epilogue, a framed narrative, or an older narrator could use him without dragging the main world into the 1920s. If a third game opened in the golden age of the frontier and closed with Jack writing decades later, his future could provide emotional completion without requiring 2 hours of driving a Model T through Blackwater. Sadie Adler leads the first major theory that steps sideways instead of forward. In 1907, she is a successful bounty hunter, scarred by her final struggle with Micah, and increasingly willing to accept that her work may kill her. She mentions the possibility of going to South America, where revolutions and opportunities might suit someone who has no home left in the United States. Rockstar leaves her alive, mobile and unclaimed by later canon. That is almost perfect sequel material. She can cross a border without contradicting the first game, meet an entirely new cast, and carry just enough history to make the world feel connected. Her combat skills also fit naturally. Sadie tracks fugitives, negotiates bounties, rides hard, and understands both gang life and lawful violence. A story could test the thin line between hunting criminals for money and becoming the thing a government calls criminal. In a new country, she would no longer enjoy the authority of an American bounty poster. Local elites might use her as hired muscle. Revolutionaries might see her as an outsider. Her instinct to meet cruelty with greater cruelty could save vulnerable people one day and create another enemy the next. Redemption for Sadie would not be learning courage. It would be discovering what remains when revenge no longer supplies a direction. South America is also the weakness in the proposal. The continent is not one interchangeable frontier, and a vague collection of jungles, revolutions, and Spanish accents would be shallow. A convincing game would need a precise country or fictional region, a carefully chosen historical moment, and local characters who are not scenery for an American gunslinger. It would also move the visual identity away from familiar Western plains. That could be refreshing. It could equally feel like a different adventure attached to Sadie's popularity. Her unresolved destination makes a strong spin-off pitch, but it does not automatically make the central third redemption. There is a subtler objection. Sadie's ending already contains a kind of freedom. She survives the role that grief forced upon her, earns her own living, and refuses to be placed back inside domestic expectations. Bringing her into another cycle of personal catastrophe could punish her for surviving the first one. A sequel would need to find conflict without killing another loved one and asking for revenge all over again. She is too specific a person to become Arthur with a South American map. The theory works only if the writers allow her humor, recklessness, loneliness, and moral impatience to create a new shape. Charles Smith offers a different road north. After helping John at Beecher's Hope and fighting Micah on Mount Hagen, Charles speaks of going to Canada and finding a wife. He wants a family, not another gang. His future is absent from Red Dead Redemption, leaving the same open space that surrounds Sadie. Canada could introduce forests, trading posts, rail camps, mining towns, winter routes, indigenous communities divided by borders, and the last echoes of several northern frontiers. Charles already understands hunting, tracking, construction, and survival. A harsher wilderness would suit the quiet competence that made him indispensable. The most thoughtful version of this theory does not begin by destroying Charles's peace. It begins with him trying to build it. A home on disputed land, work on a railway, a winter hunting camp, or a community facing corporate pressure could pull him into conflict without making him chase excitement. His mixed black and indigenous heritage would place him against several kinds of racism, while never reducing him to only a victim. He knows what the United States did to the Wapiti people. In Canada, he might discover different laws carrying familiar intentions. The story could examine whether leaving a violent country is enough when the same appetite for land crosses the border. That material demands care. Charles's background is intentionally broad in RDR2, and a full game would need cultural specificity rather than treating every indigenous nation as one symbolic people. It would also need to acknowledge that Canada was not a peaceful refuge simply because it lay beyond American agents. Residential schools, forced displacement, policing, and settler expansion belong to the history around any late 19th century story. Good research could produce one of the richest perspectives in the series. Careless research could turn Charles into a guide through generalized suffering. The emotional problem resembles Sadie's. Charles has already refused Dutch's way of life. He helps the Marstons because loyalty calls him back, then leaves with a clear hope for family. If another game burns that future down merely to hand him a gun, it would repeat the cruelty rather than explore it. A prequel about his youth avoids that damage but loses the chance to move the world forward. A sequel might work if Charles acts to preserve what he built, and if victory is measured by a community surviving rather than a pile of enemies. That would be a new kind of Red Dead ending. Some fans join Sadie and Charles into a dual protagonist story. Their paths could cross after 1907, perhaps through a bounty, a missing person, or a threat reaching both Canada and the American border. The contrast is appealing. Sadie moves toward danger because stillness frightens her. Charles accepts danger when protection requires it. She treats fury as fuel. He spends his energy carefully. Their friendship in the epilogue feels earned without being romanticized. Alternating between them could let the world hold two frontiers and two attitudes toward violence. Yet the pairing may be more comforting than necessary. Their separate endings imply separate lives. Pulling every survivor back together can make a vast world feel like a small reunion hall. Red Dead is often strongest when people lose one another and keep moving. A brief encounter would preserve that truth better than a permanent partnership. The theory reveals a common desire beneath many sequel ideas. People do not simply want a new Western. They want reassurance that the characters they loved remained alive somewhere beyond the final credits. Javier Escuela provides a darker bridge. Before joining Dutch, he was involved in political conflict in Mexico and fled after killing a powerful man. By 1911, he has become an ally of Colonel Allende's regime, far removed from the idealistic young revolutionary described around the campfire. A game set in his earlier life could show the hopes that made Dutch's philosophy attractive. A later chapter could follow the compromises that turn him into the man John hunts. Mexico would not be an excursion this time. It would be home, with its politics seen through a person who belongs there. The fan title Red Dead Revolution usually gathers around this idea. Javier could begin by fighting a corrupt order, discover that rebellion also contains ambition and cruelty, then flee north. The Van der Linde gang might appear late, offering him brotherhood at exactly the moment he has lost faith in institutions. His loyalty to Dutch in 1899 would become easier to understand. He is not merely ignoring obvious madness, he is protecting the second revolution that gave his life meaning after the first failed. There are two ways such a story could end. One would stop when Javier joins the gang, preserving his later decline as tragic knowledge held by us alone. The other would leap past 1899 and show how he returns to Mexico, why he sides with Allende, and whether survival or disillusionment destroys his old convictions. The second path has more redemption material but less freedom. We already know John reaches him in 1911, and the first game lets Javier be captured or killed. A hero whose final fate depends on an old choice made in another game creates a difficult canon problem. Javier is often paired with Bill Williamson in theories about the missing years between 1899 and 1911. They could begin as broken fugitives and gradually become the regional tyrants John later confronts. It would be a study of people who survive the gang's collapse without understanding its lesson. Bill recreates Dutch's hierarchy in a cruder form. Javier sells his gun to power while remembering himself as a rebel. That descent is dramatically sound, but it belongs more naturally to a tragedy than a redemption. A long game spent watching two familiar men become worse may offer little moral air. Among the surviving characters, then, each path contains an irony. Jack has the strongest unfinished moral question, but lives after the Western Age. Sadie has the clearest destination, but may already be free. Charles offers the richest alternative perspective, but deserves the peace he seeks. Javier has the deepest bridge to Mexico, but moves toward a fate we already know. These are not reasons to discard them. They explain why fan discussion turns so often toward the dead men waiting before Blackwater. Going backward restores the West, restores uncertainty. and returns the Van der Linde gang to the years when its promise still sounded believable. Mac Callender may be the most popular answer to the problem. He never appears alive, which gives him the freedom of a new character and the gravity of an old one. By the time the gang reaches Coulter, Mac is missing. His brother Davy is dying in a wagon. Jenny Kirk is dead, and the Blackwater ferry robbery has become a wound nobody can describe without contradicting someone else. Agent Milton later tells Arthur that Mac was captured and killed. Sean, who was also lost during the escape, knows only that Mac never returned. Between those two scraps of testimony lies enough room for an entire life. The Callender brothers are remembered as dangerous men. Charles calls them vicious, and other camp conversations suggest they enjoyed violence more readily than Arthur or Hosea did. That rough reputation is useful for a redemption protagonist. Mac does not need to begin as a hidden saint. He can arrive in the gang with habits that make Dutch's speeches feel like moral improvement. For the first time, someone tells him that robbery can serve a cause, that loyalty can turn brutality into family, and that the powerful deserve what is taken from them. If Mac later discovers that Dutch's language merely gives violence a flattering story, his redemption would involve seeing through the very dream that once seemed to save him. The theory often imagines a game covering the final years before 1899. Mac and Davy ride with the gang, while Arthur and Hosea still believe they can manage Dutch's pride. Jenny becomes more than a grave in the snow. Sean is young, reckless, and perhaps closer to the Calendars than the people who later describe them. Micah arrives and immediately senses where the group's weaknesses lie. John leaves for a year, returns to distrust, and struggles to accept Jack. The gang moves west, performs the jobs mentioned around camp, and slowly runs out of country. Because Mac stands slightly outside the central family, he can notice changes that Arthur excuses. Its supporters usually place Blackwater at the climax. We would finally see Dutch shoot Heidi McCourt, John wounded during the escape, Sean separated and captured, and the money abandoned somewhere in town. Mac might hold back the Pinkertons while the others flee. Milton's claim that he offered Mac a merciful death could be true, partly true, or a calculated weapon used against Arthur. The final playable moments might show Mac refusing to betray the gang, even after realizing that its leader has betrayed everything the gang claimed to be. His redemption would save people who never learn enough to honor it. The structure fits the series almost too neatly. A doomed outlaw gives another character time to escape, then the perspective passes to someone who survives. Arthur could become playable for a short epilogue leading toward the northern snow, or the game could end before Coulter to avoid rebuilding the opening of RDR2. This is where the theory begins to strain. Red Dead epilogues need room to breathe. They allow consequences to settle, while preserving an open world after the main character is gone. Mac dies only days before RDR2 begins. Any post-game chapter would collide directly with a story whose every movement is already known. There is also a timeline problem in the idea that Mac can reveal the whole gang's golden age. The gang began with Dutch and Hosea more than 2 decades before Blackwater. Arthur joined when he was a boy, John followed later, and the family accumulated slowly. Mac appears to belong to a more recent, rougher period. He can show the final decline, but probably not the hopeful beginning. A game focused on him may repeat the suffocating atmosphere of RDR2, law closing in, Dutch growing unstable, and people realizing too late that the plan is gone. What fans call the gang's prime might become another long funeral. Davy Calendar is the simpler variation. His death occurs before anyone has time to know him, and Dutch's grief suggests that he mattered. Playing Davy could let Mac remain an unpredictable brother rather than a blank protagonist. The final transition is visible. Davy is brought into Coulter, whispers a few words, and dies while the survivors gather around him. The image would connect two games with painful precision. It would also reduce the postgame to almost nothing. The body is buried in the snow before the gang rides south. Unless the perspective shifts to Arthur, every road closes at once. Some versions divide the story between both brothers. Mac disappears in Blackwater, while Davy survives long enough to carry part of the escape. Others use Jenny Kirk as a third viewpoint, giving the woman buried near Coulter a history that the gang failed to preserve. Multiple protagonists could show how differently people understood Dutch before the catastrophe. Mac might be drawn to power, Davy to brotherhood, and Jenny to the shelter offered by camp life. Yet almost everything beyond their deaths is invention. Their emptiness is freedom for a writer, but it is not evidence that Rockstar planted them as future heroes. Blackwater itself exerts such force that it often replaces a plot in fan pitches. The massacre is treated as the destination, and everything before it becomes a countdown. That would certainly create anticipation. We know the ferry job fails. We know Dutch kills a young woman named Heidi McCourt in circumstances that disturb John and Javier. We know the gang leaves money behind, escapes north under heavy pursuit, and loses several people. Arthur and Hosea were planning another operation and did not participate in the robbery. Micah encouraged the ferry plan. These facts form a silhouette, not a complete picture. The missing details are carefully protected in RDR2. Characters begin to discuss Blackwater and then stop. Memories conflict because nobody saw everything. John remembers Dutch in a way Arthur is not ready to accept. Javier witnessed Heidi's death but remains loyal. Dutch avoids the subject or turns it into proof that the world has become merciless. The event functions less like an unsolved puzzle than a fracture in the gang's shared reality. Before Blackwater, they could tell one story about themselves. After it, every person carries a different explanation for why the story failed. Showing the massacre would answer exciting questions. Was Heidi a hostage, a witness, or an innocent caught in panic? Did Micah push Dutch toward the shot? Why did the law respond so quickly? How exactly were the calendars lost? Where did Dutch hide the money? And who knew the location? But answers change the nature of those questions. The more precise the scene becomes, the less it resembles a traumatic memory, and the more it resembles a mission objective. A waypoint could send us onto the ferry. A meter could mark the escape. What feels legendary from a distance might become a familiar shootout once controlled by human hands. The best Blackwater theory therefore keeps the view incomplete. A protagonist on the edge of town could hear the shooting, see frightened people running, and witness only one part of the collapse. Mac might be separated before Dutch kills Heidi. Landon Ricketts might encounter survivors without knowing who began the violence. A lawman could receive contradictory reports. The disaster would become more tangible without surrendering every secret. Red Dead often understands that the past grows larger when no single person owns the whole truth. There is also a persistent claim that Landon Ricketts participated in the massacre. The original game surrounds him with legends and newspaper speculation, but his exact involvement is not securely established. Fan wikis, and repeated summaries can harden a rumor into supposed canon. That distinction matters because Landon is the center of the next major theory. He can plausibly be near Blackwater without standing on the ferry or firing the decisive shot. In fact, uncertainty would suit a man whose public reputation has become larger than the life he remembers. Landon Ricketts represents the Western era that Arthur was born too late to enjoy. He is already a legend when John meets him in Chuparosa. His gunfights have become newspaper stories. His name carries the polished certainty of dime novels. Yet the older man is neither a simple braggart nor a retired killer hiding from guilt. He protects people, trains John, and treats skill with a seriousness that separates him from decorative gunslingers. His history stretches back through the decades most fans want to explore, while much of it remains unwritten. A Landon game could begin in the 1860s or 1870s, when cattle trails, mining camps, rail expansion, and post-war violence gave the West a different texture. He might start as a young man chasing fame, because fame appears to offer immortality. Each victory would enlarge his name and narrow his private life. Newspapers would turn chaotic gunfights into clean legends. Strangers would challenge him to prove stories he did not write. By the time he reaches Mexico, the greatest gunslinger alive might understand that reputation is another kind of cage. This theory avoids many problems of the calendar proposal. Landon can travel through the true height of the frontier rather than its last season. The cast can be new, with Dutch's gang appearing only as distant rumor. The world can include rough settlements before railways discipline them, then show towns growing across the years. Blackwater could enter late as a place where Landon's legend touches the redemption story without becoming trapped inside it. He survives well beyond 1899, allowing an epilogue in Mexico where an older man chooses protection over applause. His survival creates a different problem. Both Arthur and John die in acts that define their redemption. Landon dies peacefully years later, as reported during Jack's time. That does not prevent a meaningful arc, but it removes the familiar sacrificial ending. He could lose friends, abandon a violent identity, or let another person take the glory. His redemption might occur through living with his deeds rather than escaping them through death. Such an ending would be healthy for the series, although some fans may find it less devastating than the pattern they expect. The title also presses awkwardly against him. By the time John meets Landon, the old gunfighter seems to have found his moral balance. He uses violence freely, but he does not appear haunted by an unatoned central crime. A prequel would need to invent that wound. Perhaps his fame was built on another person's sacrifice. Perhaps a celebrated gunfight was actually a massacre. Perhaps he once served men like Leviticus Cornwall and spent his later life defending towns from the kind of power he helped create. These can work, but they are not clues hidden in the games. They are new stories placed inside an appealing silhouette. Landon also opens a path toward famous gunslingers already encountered in RDR2. Black Bell, Flaco Hernandez, Billy Midnight, Emmett Granger, and Jim Boy Calloway belong to a generation whose legends have decayed by 1899. A younger Landon might cross their paths before vanity, fear, and old age settle over them. The danger is a parade of cameos. If every chapter explains how a familiar photograph was taken, the world shrinks into a museum tour. Those figures should appear only where their choices alter Landon's life, not simply because the name is familiar. The theory that young Landon trains young Jack attempts to connect both ends of the timeline. Landon is alive when John rides through Mexico, and a newspaper later reports his death around the period when Jack takes revenge. Fans imagine a hidden meeting in those final years, perhaps with the old gunslinger teaching the son as he once taught the father. It is emotionally neat and unsupported. Jack's polished skill can be explained by growing up around expert gunmen, practicing alone, and inheriting habits from John. A secret mentor would weaken the loneliness of his final hunt. Far more popular than any one gunslinger is the desire to see the Van der Linde gang being formed. Dutch and Hosea meet in the late 1870s through a failed attempt to rob one another. The two men become partners, then take in a young Arthur. John arrives later. Their early life is remembered as lean but principled, with robberies directed toward wealthy targets and occasional generosity toward people in need. The bank robbery at Lee and Hoyt, where the gang reportedly gave money away, survives as the clearest image of the Robin Hood period Dutch spends 1899 trying to invoke. A founding-era game could finally let that ideal breathe. Dutch would not enter as a man whose speeches already sound hollow. He might be genuinely brave, intellectually curious, and capable of choosing people over money. Hosea would be more than the tired conscience trying to slow him down. He would be a gifted fraud, actor, thief, and reader of human weakness, perhaps the more dangerous of the pair when they first meet. Their affection could feel surprising rather than inevitable. Watching them become family would make their eventual division in Saint-Denis more painful. Hosea is often proposed as the playable character because he sits at the moral hinge of the gang. He loves Dutch without worshipping him, understands Arthur's sensitivity before Arthur does, and eventually recognizes that the dream has become an excuse. His youth contains Bessie, a relationship remembered with a tenderness rare in the gang's history. A story could follow Hosea leaving crime for her, trying honest life, and returning after loss or necessity. He knows how to inhabit different identities, which could expand robberies beyond gunfights into disguises, confidence schemes, forged papers, and social manipulation. The playstyle would be refreshingly different. Hosea wins by reading a room. He studies who wants to feel important, who fears embarrassment, and who can be led toward a conclusion they believe is their own. Hunting with him in RDR2 shows patience rather than aggression. A younger version could still be quick with a gun, but his signature missions would turn conversation and preparation into forms of action. The camp system might begin with only Dutch and gradually grow as they rescue, recruit, or shelter people. His moral destination is less clear. Hosea dies in 1899 without a personal redemption arc comparable to Arthur's. He has regrets, but his late advice reveals that he already understands them. If the game ends decades earlier, what change completes the story? Choosing Bessie over the gang could provide one answer, although we know he eventually returns. Protecting young Arthur from Dutch's worst influence could provide another, but that work ultimately fails. Hosea is an excellent center for a family history and a difficult center for a self-contained tragedy. Playing Dutch would answer even more and risk far more. In 1899, the uncertainty around him matters. Was he always a narcissist whose mask slipped under pressure? Did brain injury, grief, Micah's influence, and relentless pursuit turn a flawed idealist into a tyrant? Did he believe his own philosophy, or did he only believe in the version of himself standing at its center? A prequel, controlled through Dutch's eyes, might settle those questions. The player would hear his private thoughts, choose his actions, and know whether generosity came from love or performance. That certainty could flatten him. Dutch is compelling because he is intimate and unreachable at once. Arthur knows his habits but cannot know his soul. Hosea can challenge him but cannot force honesty. Even Dutch may not recognize when belief becomes self-protection. Making him playable would tempt the story to diagnose him. A high-honor Dutch could become too sympathetic, while a low-honor Dutch would turn later loyalty into foolishness. Keeping him beside the protagonist allows his charm to work without explaining every mechanism beneath it. A younger Arthur seems inevitable in any gang origin story. He joins Dutch and Hosea at about 14 after a hard childhood and the death of his mother. His father, Lyle, was a criminal whom Arthur remembers without warmth. Dutch gives the boy education, purpose, and a language for his anger. Hosea teaches practical survival and a gentler form of intelligence. The adult Arthur's loyalty becomes understandable because the gang did not merely employ him, it shaped the person capable of understanding loyalty at all. Roger Clark's statement that Arthur's story is told does not prevent a supporting role. Young Arthur could begin as a silent, watchful teenager, grow into the gang's most reliable enforcer, and appear in an epilogue without taking over the whole game. The challenge would be restraint. Once Arthur enters, affection could pull every scene toward him. Fans would wait for his first horse, first journal, first meeting with Mary, first encounter with John, and first use of a familiar phrase. A story about Hosea or an unknown founder could disappear beneath an origin checklist. Time itself becomes the largest obstacle. Dutch and Hosea meet roughly 20 years before Blackwater. Arthur's arrival, John's childhood, Hosea's life with Bessie, the recruitment of Susan, Javier, Bill, Charles, and the others, the deaths of Annabelle and Colm's brother, John's year away, and Micah's recent arrival cannot fit comfortably into one continuous season. A game could use major time jumps, allowing towns and characters to age. That would be ambitious and potentially beautiful. It could also make relationships feel summarized. Red Dead earns attachment through ordinary days at camp, and ordinary days are the first things a 20-year montage removes. An unknown early gang member solves several of these problems. Dutch and Hosea might take in someone before Arthur, a person whose name was erased after death or betrayal. This protagonist could help build the family's best traditions, then recognize a fault line nobody else is ready to see. Their final act might secure a future for the young boys, while leaving Dutch free to rewrite what happened. Arthur grows up believing a cleaner version of the story. The third game would reveal that the gang's founding myth contained a sacrifice from the beginning. The risk is obvious. Inventing a previously essential person whom nobody mentions can feel like inserting a secret foundation under a finished house. Silence would need a reason stronger than convenience. Perhaps the person used another name, left rather than died, or became an enemy whose memory Dutch forbade. Perhaps their erasure is itself evidence of Dutch's control over the gang's history. Done well, the absence becomes meaningful. Done poorly, every old conversation begins to feel artificially incomplete. The feud with Colm O'Driscoll supplies an existing fracture large enough to hold such a story. Dutch and Colm were once associates or friends before blood transformed their relationship. Dutch killed Colm's brother. Colm killed Annabelle, the woman Dutch loved. By 1899, Both men command gangs and use the feud to justify fresh bodies. Neither speaks of the beginning with enough detail to establish who first crossed the line. That gap invites a game set when their alliances still overlap. Annabelle is sometimes imagined as the protagonist, though almost nothing is known about her beyond Dutch's love and Colm's revenge. Giving her a life would immediately change the feud. Instead of existing as the woman whose death explains a man's hatred, she could be a thief, planner, informant, or skeptic with reasons of her own for remaining near Dutch. She might see his desire to control the story before Hosea admits it. Her death is fixed, but the meaning of it is not. A final choice could protect another person, expose Colm, or deny Dutch the vengeance she knows he will pursue. That theory asks Rockstar to center a doomed character whose identity is nearly blank. It also risks repeating the familiar use of a woman's death to deepen a male anti-hero. The only reason to choose Annabelle would be to overturn that pattern, not decorate it. Her relationships beyond Dutch would need to matter. Colm's decision to kill her would need political or personal dimensions beyond equivalent revenge. Most importantly, her interior life could not be reduced to recognizing Dutch's future darkness before everyone else. Playing an O'Driscoll offers an even sharper reversal. RDR2 presents Colm's gang as numerous, disposable, and loosely bound. Its members occupy cabins and camps, rob travelers, feud with Dutch, and die without the intimate mourning seen at Horseshoe Overlook. A protagonist inside that organization could reveal people whom Arthur treats as anonymous threats. Dutch and his sons would become frightening riders appearing over a ridge. A high-honor Arthur in our memory might still be a brutal enforcer in somebody else's story. One fan version follows a small O'Driscoll crew whose lives are destroyed by the Van der Linde gang. The hero slowly realizes that Colm values replacement bodies rather than family, while Dutch's group is not the noble alternative it claims to be. Caught between leaders who convert grief into loyalty, the protagonist helps ordinary members escape both. This would let the third game revisit familiar history without asking us to cheer for young Dutch. It could also expose how gang legends are built by forgetting the people left dead along the road. The danger lies in symmetry. Dutch and Colm are not identical, even if each uses followers. Dutch creates genuine bonds and then corrupts them. Colm appears more willing to treat numbers as power from the beginning. Making both gangs secretly the same would erase an important distinction. The better story would show why Dutch's family seems humane enough to inspire devotion, while Colm's organization seems easier to abandon. The protagonist might envy Arthur before discovering the cost of being loved by Dutch. Lyle Morgan carries the prequel farther back than the gang. Arthur's father was a criminal, died by hanging, and left his son with little affection. Arthur keeps a photograph of him and says that the man did not die soon enough. From those few facts, fans have imagined a story about Lyle's crimes, Arthur's mother Beatrice, and the childhood that taught Arthur to distrust tenderness. The final image would be young Arthur watching the execution before eventually meeting Dutch and Hosea. There is an appealing severity to the idea. A player could inhabit a man who fails redemption, leaving his son to search for better fathers among outlaws. The title would become ironic. Lyle receives opportunities to change and rejects them until the rope ends his choices. Arthur's later life would stand as the redemption Lyle could not achieve. A game does not require its protagonist to become good, only to make the cost of refusing change clear. Still, Almost everything interesting about Lyle comes from Arthur's rejection of him. Turning the father into a complicated anti-hero might soften a relationship that does not need rehabilitation. Some theories go further and claim Lyle secretly fathered John, making Arthur and John biological brothers. Nothing in the games supports this. It also misunderstands the power of their bond. They become brothers through shared life, betrayal, forgiveness, and choice. A hidden blood connection would make that chosen relationship less meaningful, not more. Lyle is therefore strongest as a prologue or shadow, not a 60-hour companion. His hanging could open a story about young Arthur without asking us to spend days justifying an abusive father. It might show how public execution, poverty, and criminal inheritance shaped a boy the respectable world had already discarded. But once Dutch appears and offers belonging, the emotional center would shift immediately. The real mystery is not why Lyle failed. It is why Dutch's alternative felt so much like rescue. Every gang-centered prequel eventually reaches the same choice. It can explain Blackwater, explain Dutch, explain Arthur, and explain the feud, or it can preserve enough darkness for the earlier games to remain alive. Explanation feels satisfying in the moment. Mystery lasts longer. The wisest version would reveal the gang at its best, while allowing the seeds of ruin to remain visible only in retrospect. Dutch need not twirl a metaphorical moustache. Arthur need not predict his own death. A warm campfire can be honest warmth, even if the people beside it will one day burn the camp down. Young Rain's Fall leads away from the gang and into a history the series has approached with unusual seriousness but never centered. In 1899, he is a leader trying to keep the Wapiti people alive under pressure from the United States government, the army, industrial interests, and despair within his own family. He speaks from experience rather than passivity. He tells Arthur that he was once angry, that he fought, and that violence cost him his wife and another son. His restraint is not fear. It is the hard conclusion of a man who has already followed the road Eagle Flies wants to take. A prequel could begin before that conclusion. Fans often place it in the 1870s, around the period of intense conflict between the United States and indigenous nations across the northern plains and mountain west. A younger Rain's Fall might believe he can defend his people through direct resistance. The death of his family would then be more than backstory. It would become the event that changes how he understands leadership. Redemption would mean giving up the emotional satisfaction of vengeance to preserve lives, even while knowing that restraint cannot make a dishonest government honorable. The perspective would transform familiar Western systems. A railway would not merely unlock fast travel or announce modernity. It could divide hunting grounds, carry soldiers, and accelerate settlement. Bison would not be collectible entries waiting for a perfect pelt. Their destruction would have political meaning. A fort could be both a military threat and a place where negotiation becomes unavoidable. The land itself would hold names, roots, and relationships that a commercial map fails to record. What appears empty to a settler would already be dense with memory. Rain's Fall also offers a natural contrast with the honor system. High honor could involve patience, diplomacy, and protection. But the game would need to avoid treating survival under invasion as a simple moral quiz. Violence may be necessary in one moment and disastrous in another. Peaceful choices can save people or allow an enemy more time. A leader often chooses between harms rather than good and evil. That uncertainty fits Red Dead better than a meter that praises obedience and punishes anger. Careful historical grounding would be essential. There is no single generic indigenous experience. Nations differed in language, political structure, territory, alliances, and responses to United States expansion. The Wapiti are fictional, but fiction does not remove the obligation to understand the real histories used around them. Indigenous writers, historians, performers, and cultural advisors would need authority within the project, not ceremonial credit after the central story had already been decided. Otherwise, a promising viewpoint could collapse into familiar images of noble suffering. The violence committed by the state would also need to remain systemic, rather than concentrated in one cartoon officer. RDR2 partly handles this through Colonel Favors, whose greed and racism give the conflict a face. A full game could show contracts, agencies, railroad companies, reservation policies, traders, newspapers, and local settlers all participating in different ways. Some people might be openly murderous. Others might sincerely describe dispossession as progress. The second group can be more frightening because they sleep comfortably inside the language of law. This is why the theory has unusual thematic strength. Both redemption games ask what happens when the world decides certain people no longer belong. For Arthur and John, outlaw identity brings that pressure. For an indigenous protagonist, the threat reaches far beyond individual crimes. Good behavior cannot purchase acceptance. The law is not simply responding to the hero's violence, it is helping clear the land. Redemption would therefore need to become collective, saving one family, preserving a route north, carrying language forward, or helping children survive may matter more than clearing a personal debt. Some fans prefer an original indigenous protagonist who crosses paths with Rain's Fall. This avoids forcing every possible choice into the known biography of a revered older character. A scout, interpreter, hunter, displaced survivor, or person with family across two nations could see conflicts Rain's Fall is not present for. The story could end with the protagonist helping his people reach safety, while Rain's Fall continues toward the future we know. It would also allow the lead to die, leave, or survive without contradicting his later appearance. Others propose playing Eagle Flies in the short period before RDR2, but his arc is too tightly contained. We already witnessed the most important conflict of his adult life, from anger through Dutch's manipulation to death at Beaver Hollow. Expanding his earlier years might add affection but not uncertainty. Rain's Fall carries decades of hidden change. An original figure carries freedom. Eagle Flies carries an ending that RDR2 already gives full emotional weight. A young Rain's Fall game could include the gang only lightly. Arthur's meeting with him in 1899 gains power because they arrive from different histories and recognize the same sickness in Dutch's promises. They do not need a secret encounter 20 years earlier. Constantly tying major figures together would shrink the country again. At most, Dutch and Hosea could appear as distant young outlaws benefiting from the same unsettled frontier, never realizing whose land makes their freedom possible. Black Belle offers a less solemn but equally independent return to the western peak. When Arthur finds her, she is one of the few famous gunslingers who has not collapsed into self-pity, fraudulent memory, or frightened isolation. She keeps moving, sets explosives around her shelter, laughs in the middle of a gunfight, and leaves before the men hunting her can close in. Her history includes gangs and adventures that the game barely names. Unlike Calloway, she does not need a writer to manufacture courage. A Black Bell story could embrace motion. Rather than build one permanent camp, she might pass through temporary crews, boomtowns, riverboats, mining settlements, and outlaw hideouts across several decades. Fame would follow her, while the truth changes from place to place. In one state, she is a murderer. In another, she is a folk hero. A newspaper might credit her for a robbery she never committed, then ignore a rescue that mattered to her. The game could ask whether a person can control a legend once the public begins buying it. Her survival changes the expected ending. Black Bell remains active after Arthur meets her, and nothing requires a tragic death. Her redemption might involve refusing the final gunfight that would secure her immortality. She could expose Calloway's manufactured reputation, protect someone who will never know her name, or choose anonymity over the attention she once enjoyed. The closing image could be a woman riding away while a false obituary declares her dead. In a series obsessed with graves, vanishing would feel almost rebellious. The challenge is finding the wound beneath her confidence without draining the confidence away. Black Bell is appealing because she does not arrive apologizing for occupying a violent world. A long origin story could fall into the habit of explaining strength through a catalogue of abuse. She deserves motives beyond trauma, and relationships beyond men who underestimate her. Humor, vanity, professional pride, affection, greed, and genuine love of adventure could coexist. Redemption need not turn her quiet or respectable. Her theory often expands into an ensemble of legendary gunslingers. A game might follow the Coulter Tobin gang, place her beside a younger Landon Ricketts, or show the real events that Theodore Levin later struggles to uncover. That creates opportunities for different mission styles and conflicting accounts. It also invites a familiar trap. Every legend becomes connected to every other. The West should feel large enough for Black Bell to hear a story about Landon without meeting him, and for Red Harlow's name to reach a campfire as something nobody can verify. Red Harlow stands at the border between Rockstar's two Western identities. Red Dead Revolver is stranger, faster, and more openly built from exaggerated Western archetypes than the Redemption games. Its hero seeks revenge for the murder of his parents, faces colorful enemies, and moves through a world that feels like a story told by someone who improves each detail with every retelling. References inside Redemption suggest that a figure named Red Harlow exists as folklore, but they do not place every event of Revolver cleanly inside the later continuity. One theory proposes a grounded remake. Red Harlow's adventure would be retold as the historical events beneath the legend. Impossible flourishes become exaggerated memories. Brightly theatrical villains become real people distorted by dime novels. Contradictory versions of a gunfight could appear depending on who tells it. By the end, the player might understand that Red was not one perfect avenger, but a person whose pain was consumed by public entertainment. The old game would remain true as folklore even where the new account differs. This could be excellent, and would probably not be Red Dead Redemption 3. A Red Dead Revolver reimagining carries its own name and expectations. It does not need Arthur, John, or Dutch. Calling it the third Redemption would create confusion before the story begins. The theory remains popular because it offers a way to honor the series' beginning while returning to the height of Western myth. It is less a prediction than a proposal for how Rockstar might keep Red Dead alive without disturbing the completed Marston arc. The claim that Uncle is secretly Red Harlow is the most famous bridge between the games and one of the weakest when treated literally. Fans compare scars, vague stories, age ranges, and Uncle's boastful references to a dangerous youth. They imagine the legendary bounty hunter growing old, hiding his identity, developing lumbago, and joining Dutch's camp as comic camouflage. The contrast is entertaining. A feared avenger ending life as an irritable ranch hand has the shape of a Western joke. Physical and biographical details do not line up reliably. Uncle's known or claimed history, his age, his appearance, and the different continuity surrounding Revolver resist the identification. More importantly, the theory would damage Uncle's role. He is funny because he may have lived an adventurous life and still became an ordinary, lazy, perceptive old man. His final defense of Beecher's hope proves that courage does not require a secret legendary identity. Making him Red Harlow would turn a modest act of loyalty into a superhero reveal. Red Harlow can remain useful without becoming Uncle. His legend could appear differently across regions. A child repeats one version, a retired sheriff another, and an old outlaw insists Red never existed. A future protagonist might discover a grave bearing the wrong date, or meet someone who claims to have ridden with him. This would preserve the porous boundary between history and storytelling that makes Red Dead's world feel older than any one campaign. The strongest alternative to all familiar names is also the simplest: begin again. Create a new protagonist, a new gang or community, and a map far enough from the redemption states that Arthur's story becomes distant background. Many fans argue that the Vanderlinde saga has reached the exact ending it deserves. Another prequel could explain it to death, while another sequel could push it out of the Western genre. A new cast lets Red Dead return to the 1870s or 1880s without turning every sunrise into foreshadowing for Blackwater. Fresh characters would restore uncertainty. We would not know who survives, which town burns, whether the central relationship can be repaired, or whether a promising child becomes a familiar adult. The writers could build redemption around a different crime. Perhaps the hero served the army and participated in violence they can no longer justify. Perhaps they enforced a railroad's land claims, betrayed striking workers, abandoned a sibling, or helped a town expel people who had lived there for generations. The past would still close in, but not through Pinkertons repeating the same pursuit. A post-Civil War veteran is one common proposal. The war left armed men carrying trauma, political hatred, and uncertain futures across the country. A former Confederate could offer a severe redemption story, but it would require refusing romantic myths about the cause he served. A Union veteran might discover that victory against slavery did not end racial terror or prevent the government from using force in the West. Either person could find that military habits make survival easier and peace harder. The most promising version would avoid treating war trauma as an excuse for every act. The protagonist's choices during and after the war should matter. A veteran who participated in a massacre, deserted vulnerable companions, or profited from stolen land would face specific guilt. The open world could show veterans on all sides trying to become sheriffs, ranchers, gunfighters, politicians, and criminals. Their uniforms are gone, but the conflict continues through memory and local power. A black cowboy could bring another underused history into the center. Black riders, ranch hands, drovers, scouts, marshals, homesteaders, and outlaws were part of the West, even when popular movies pushed them to the margins. Red Dead includes characters such as Charles, Lenny, Tilly, and Marshall Johnson, but has never built its full Western world around that experience. A new protagonist could move through spaces where skill earns temporary respect, while law and custom still deny safety. This story could begin during Reconstruction or its collapse, connecting Southern political violence to movement west. The hero might join a cattle drive because the trail offers wages and distance, only to learn that freedom on horseback remains conditional when the drive reaches town. Land ownership, family reunion, military service, and the creation of black settlements could provide stakes beyond becoming the fastest gun. Redemption might involve building something durable after years spent believing motion was the only protection. The Buffalo Soldier theory overlaps with that idea, but carries moral complexity of its own. Black soldiers served in Western regiments while facing racism from the country whose uniform they wore. They built roads, guarded routes, fought in the Indian Wars, and participated in the expansion that displaced indigenous peoples. A protagonist within that history could not be reduced to noble service. He might believe the army offers dignity and stability, then confront what his orders require him to defend. An escape from the army could create the outlaw portion of the story. Desertion, whistleblowing, or refusal to take part in an atrocity places the hero outside federal law. Former comrades pursue him, some from duty and some because his testimony threatens careers. Indigenous characters would need their own goals and authority, not exist merely to forgive him. The strongest ending might involve exposing a crime while accepting that public truth cannot restore everyone harmed by it. A Mexican or Mexican-American protagonist could root the next game in Borderlands history rather than sending an American visitor south. Vaquero traditions shaped much of what later became the popular cowboy image, from equipment and riding practice to language. A family divided by a changing border could move between ranch work, local politics, smuggling, military pressure, and revolution. Mexico would cease to be the exotic chapter reached halfway through an American story. This option also opens California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas-inspired country, and northern Mexican regions without repeating Nuevo Paraíso exactly. The hero might speak several languages and belong fully to communities on both sides, while authorities insist on simpler categories. Railroad companies, mining interests, old land grants, and new settlers could create conflict more grounded than a single rival gang. The Red Dead theme of a world erasing inconvenient people would remain, but the people at the center would change. An outlaw woman, unrelated to the existing cast, offers similar freedom. Black Belle and Sadie prove that the series can write women who act inside Western violence, yet both arrive with much of their history hidden or already shaped by another protagonist's story. A new lead could be a rancher facing dispossession, a confidence artist, a former stage performer, a fugitive accused under another person's name, or a gang leader whose community depends on crimes she no longer controls. Her central problem would not need to be proving that she can shoot as well as men. Fans also imagine a lawman who becomes an outlaw. The first two games begin inside criminal communities and gradually reveal the humanity hidden beneath public labels. Reversing the path could show how law manufactures those labels. A deputy believes order protects ordinary people, then discovers that his badge mainly protects rail property, wealthy ranchers, and political allies. When he refuses an order, yesterday's officer appears on tomorrow's bounty poster. He knows every tactic that will be used against him because he once used them. That setup could make the wanted system part of character rather than inconvenience. Former friends recognize his habits. Towns remember arrests he made. People he mistreated may refuse help even when his cause becomes honorable. Redemption would require more than exposing a corrupt sheriff. He would have to listen to those who experienced him as the corruption. The story could ask whether becoming an outlaw makes a man free or simply removes the institution that used to excuse his violence. A civilian protagonist is less common and perhaps more radical. Red Dead's worlds contain farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, performers, undertakers, cooks, preachers, sex workers, and families living around the gunfighters. A person from that world might be forced into flight after witnessing a murder or losing land to a corporation. They would learn to shoot slowly, with fear and consequence. Every weapon upgrade would mark a change rather than confirm an identity established before the opening scene. The objection is practical. Red Dead promises expert movement, frequent combat, and freedom to create chaos. A hero who remains morally horrified by killing can clash with an open world that allows dozens of gunfights. Arthur survives the contradiction because violence has been his profession for years. A civilian would need a long transformation or systems that make avoidance, negotiation, and surrender genuinely viable. That challenge could produce innovation, but it would change the rhythm people expect. Several fans propose an anthology instead of one hero. Separate chapters could follow characters across different Western regions and decades, connected by an object, a crime, a family, or a changing town. A revolver passes from a soldier to an outlaw, then a lawman, then a child who sells it after the frontier closes. Each chapter reveals how the previous person's legend differs from reality. The final figure might be Jack Marston, Black Bell, or an unknown writer gathering the stories. An anthology solves the timeline problem and allows historical range. It also sacrifices the slow attachment that makes camp life powerful. Arthur matters because we inhabit his habits for a long time. His horse, journal, clothes, and changing face accumulate meaning through repetition. Leaving a protagonist after 10 hours might feel like departing just as a life begins to deepen. A multi-generation family could preserve attachment better, though that would move Red Dead toward a Western saga rather than an outlaw biography. The new cast theory does not require absolute isolation. A newspaper can mention Landon Ricketts. A young Hosea can appear during a confidence trick. The player may pass a camp where someone tells an impossible Red Harlow story. A late mission could involve a charming outlaw named Dutch, without revealing his whole future. These touches make history feel shared while keeping the new people central. The difference between connection and dependence is scale. A world feels large when famous lives cross briefly and continue in separate directions. History supports the appetite for an earlier date. The decades after the Civil War brought enormous movement across the American West. Railroads linked markets while cutting through existing communities. Mining rushes created towns that grew quickly and sometimes vanished just as fast. Cattle drives supported one image of cowboy life, while fencing, corporate ranching, and changing transportation steadily altered it. Federal policy forced indigenous peoples from land, and military violence enforced expansion. Immigrants from many countries built railways, worked mines, opened businesses, and faced exclusion. The Western world was never one empty landscape waiting for lone gunmen. An earlier Red Dead could therefore feel less civilized than 1899 without becoming less political. The state would be uneven rather than absent. A mining company might exercise more practical power than a distant government. A town committee could hire armed men, then call their violence law. Telegraph lines would make news travel faster than horses, while still allowing rumor to outrun truth. Settlements could change visibly over several years, with tents becoming streets, and streets becoming places the original residents can no longer afford. That changing environment appears frequently in gameplay theories. Imagine returning to a valley after a long chapter and finding railway workers, felled trees, and a station where there had been open grass. A settlement grows around the tracks, bringing shops, conflict, and disease. Later, the railroad chooses another route, leaving empty buildings behind. The transformation would not be a background animation. It would alter hunting, prices, law response, travel, and the lives of people the protagonist knows. Such a system would give time jumps physical weight. Instead of a title card announcing that 5 years passed, the map would carry the evidence. A child becomes a stable hand. A muddy camp acquires brick sidewalks. A river is dammed. Bison herds thin. Telegraph poles advance toward a once isolated ranch. Red Dead Redemption 2 already uses construction sites and changing rail lines to suggest this process. A third game set earlier could make the transformation the central movement of the world. The map theories grow naturally from these possible lives. The most common direction is west, toward fictional versions of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Oregon, and Washington. RDR2 tells us that Dutch's gang is fleeing east after Blackwater, and that several members know Western country we never see. Returning to an earlier era while moving the playable world toward the Pacific would restore the sense of frontier without discarding every familiar state. A California-inspired region could contain several landscapes without feeling arbitrary. Redwoods and wet northern forests give way to agricultural valleys, dry interior country, high mountains, desert, and a coastal city transformed by trade and migration. A San Francisco-like metropolis could serve as an earlier counterpart to Saint Denis, dense enough to represent modern money, but culturally distinct from the southern port. Gold Rush history would leave abandoned camps, wealthy speculators, damaged rivers, and communities built by people from across the Pacific. The Pacific Northwest appears in fan maps as a territory of rain, logging, islands, mountains, and remote settlements. It would suit Charles, a new hunter, or a story about a railway reaching the coast. Dense forests could make tracking and ambushes feel different from open plains. Water travel might matter through canoes, ferries, and coastal steamers. The risk is visual closeness to Roanoke Ridge or tall trees. Distinct cultures, industries, and weather patterns would need to carry more than scenery. Utah and Nevada-inspired country would favor a harsher inland game. Salt flats, red canyons, mining districts, religious settlements, military roads, and desert towns could expand the New Austin feeling without simply enlarging the same sand. Water access might shape travel. Mining claims could create temporary economies and violent disputes. A boomtown at the beginning could be an exhausted ruin by the epilogue, its wealth carried away by people who never intended to stay. Many concept maps combine these western regions with New Austin and Mexico. The attraction is understandable. A third game could provide the complete journey people imagined when RDR2's inaccessible areas and borders inspired speculation. Riders move from northern forest to Pacific coast, cross desert, and continue into a larger Mexico. Familiar locations such as Armadillo or Tumbleweed appear decades earlier, full of life before disease and economic change hollow them out. Reusing too much land creates its own fatigue. New Austin already appears in both Redemption games, and much of RDR2's version has limited story involvement. A larger map is not automatically a richer one. If old states return, time should transform them enough to justify the distance. A river might follow the same course, while every settlement, road, political boundary, and local danger differs. Recognition should produce melancholy, not merely save development work. Some fans want the entire RDR2 map preserved, with the western edge extended. That dream is technically imaginable and narratively excessive. A country stretching from a Pacific analog through Lemoyne would require enormous travel and would encourage disconnected content. More importantly, gang dialogue suggests that parts of the eastern and southern map are unfamiliar in 1899. A prequel cannot casually send Arthur through every street of Saint-Denis without changing later reactions. Familiar geography carries continuity obligations. Mexico remains the most requested returning region because the first Redemption gives it a strong identity, and RDR2 leaves it mostly beyond reach. A larger Nuevo Paraíso could show political conditions before the 1911 rebellion, or an entirely new northern region could connect to Javier's history. The land should not wait frozen for John Marston. Towns, factions, farms, mines, and families would need their own stories, with later revolution emerging from pressures already visible. Canada is more likely in theories centered on Charles, Rain's fall, or the movement of people escaping American law. Snow alone would not distinguish it from Amberino. Border enforcement, resource industries, indigenous sovereignty, policing, and migration would. A Yukon-inspired gold rush could place sudden wealth against brutal distance. Thousands of hopeful people move north, and businesses selling supplies profit more reliably than miners. Charles might see another dream of freedom being organized into exploitation. South America belongs chiefly to Sadie's future. Fan maps often treat it as one exotic block, which is precisely why the theory needs discipline. Patagonia could preserve open riding country and harsh weather. A fictional Andean region could combine high settlements, mines, railways, and political upheaval. A tropical coastal republic would create another kind of landscape altogether. Choosing all of them would reduce a continent to a theme park. Choosing one carefully could make a remarkable western-adjacent frontier. Australia occasionally appears as a wilder proposal. Bushrangers, colonial policing, gold fields, cattle stations, and vast distances offer clear parallels to Western stories. It would free the series from American continuity while preserving horses and outlaw folklore. It would also need to confront British colonial violence and Aboriginal history with the same care required of an indigenous-centered American game. The Red Dead name could travel there, but Redemption 3 probably would not. The map debate ultimately reveals two different desires. One group wants to go home, more Blackwater, more New Austin, Mexico restored, and younger versions of people already loved. The other wants the feeling of leaving home, where the next ridge is unfamiliar and no grave marker tells us the ending. Rockstar cannot satisfy both completely. The best compromise would use a mostly new western map connected to one old region at its edge. Familiar land becomes an anchor rather than the whole voyage. Location is only half of these imagined games. Fans have also spent years predicting their structure, and the most persistent idea is a return to multiple protagonists. Grand Theft Auto 5 proved that Rockstar can build a large story around shifting viewpoints, while Red Dead Redemption 2 already changes leads after Arthur's death. A third Red Dead might make the change available from the beginning. Dutch, Hosea, and an unknown recruit could see the same gang differently. Mac and Davy could become two versions of brotherhood. A lawman and outlaw could pursue one another until each discovers the institution behind their conflict. The benefit is perspective. Red Dead stories depend on people misunderstanding the family around them. Arthur sees Dutch through the memory of rescue. John sees the danger sooner because his year away gives him distance. Hosea sees an old partner he can still reach until he cannot. Switching among them would reveal those private worlds without forcing one person to overhear every important conversation. A robbery planned by Hosea might be performed by Arthur and remembered by Dutch as his own triumph. The differences would become part of the story. Constant switching could also weaken intimacy. Arthur's body, journal, horse, and daily habits make the second game feel inhabited rather than observed. If control moves every hour, no saddle gathers enough memory. Grand Theft Auto's energy suits sudden jumps across a city. Red Dead's melancholy grows from staying beside someone through long, quiet stretches. A dual structure might work if divided into large acts instead of instant switching. Each life would receive time to settle before the next perspective changes what we thought we knew. One particularly elegant version follows a pursuer and a fugitive. The outlaw spends early chapters treating the law as a faceless machine. The lawman believes the outlaw's gang is responsible for disorder, threatening ordinary people. Their missions leave consequences for one another. A burned hideout becomes evidence. A protected witness becomes a target. Midway through the story, both uncover a company or political network using the conflict to clear land, win contracts, or conceal a massacre. They do not need to become friends. Understanding can arrive without forgiveness. Another structure places two characters on opposite sides of the Dutch column feud. One enters the warm but controlling Van der Linde camp. The other survives among O'Driscolls who offer less affection and fewer illusions. Each hears a different account of the same killing. Missions occasionally cross, showing how heroic action from one viewpoint becomes terror from the other. The story could culminate in a choice that saves people from both gangs, while allowing Dutch and Colm to continue believing revenge is leadership. Multiple protagonists are often connected to a generational theory. The first character lives during the frontier's height, the second during its consolidation, and the third near its end. A ranch, town, weapon, or family links them. Choices made decades earlier alter later property lines, local legends, and relationships. The player might spend the opening hours helping establish a settlement, then return as another person to discover that its success displaced the people who made it possible. Progress would carry memory as well as new buildings. This kind of time progression is one of the most ambitious predictions. Fans picture a map that changes over 20 or 30 years. Rail lines advance, forests retreat, mines open and close, and camps become cities. The protagonist ages visibly. Horses die or retire. Children inherit businesses. Newspapers remember events inaccurately. Rather than tell us that the West is ending, the landscape would let us watch the process happen under our feet. The technical difficulty would be immense. Every changing town creates new interiors, schedules, dialogue, roads, prices, and mission conditions. Wildlife populations and travel routes would need to respond. Side stories begun in one period require outcomes in another. The reward, however, would suit Red Dead perfectly. Time would stop being a chapter transition and become the largest force in the game. Nobody can shoot it, escape it, or pay a bounty to make it forget. An aging protagonist follows naturally. Arthur's appearance changes through hair growth, weight, illness, and injury, but his adult identity remains stable until tuberculosis accelerates the end. A game spanning decades could show speed, eyesight, stamina, and social position changing more gradually. A young gunfighter wins through reflex. The older version reads danger earlier, speaks with greater authority, and knows routes unavailable on any map. Losing physical ability would be balanced by knowledge rather than treated as simple decline. This system could make Landon Ricketts especially effective. His famous Dead-Eye skill begins almost supernatural, then becomes deliberate economy as he ages. A younger Landon fires 6 shots because he can. An older Landon fires one because he has learned what the other 5 would cost. If the game instead follows Hosea, age might improve deception while making direct combat dangerous. Character development would alter play without placing morality inside a menu. The honor system itself attracts many predictions. In RDR2, honor changes Arthur's tone, certain outcomes, prices, and the imagery surrounding his death. It asks whether a person who has done terrible things can still decide what kind of man he will be today. For a third game, fans want consequences that are more local and less easily washed away by greeting everyone in Saint Denis. Reputation could differ between towns, factions, and communities. A celebrated lawman in one county might be remembered as a butcher across the river. Local reputation would suit a story about legends. Newspapers could create one public identity while witnesses carry another. Wearing a mask might conceal a face but not a horse, weapon, voice, or method. Helping a settlement could bring free meals and unwanted expectations. Fear might prevent testimony while closing shops and emptying streets. Honor would become a network of memories rather than a single line between red and white. The danger is turning moral life into accounting. If every kindness adds points with one faction and subtracts them from another, choice becomes optimization. Red Dead works when an action has emotional consequences not revealed in advance. A widow may accept money and still despise the person who made her a widow. A community may celebrate a rescued prisoner who later causes harm. The game should remember, without pretending it can calculate the value of everything. Rumors about a deeper law system follow the same desire. RDR2 allows witnesses, masks, investigations, bounties, jail, and escalating pursuit. yet its rules sometimes bend to keep action moving. A third game could distinguish between crimes seen, crimes inferred, and crimes attached to an established reputation. Sheriffs might question people, post descriptions, inspect stolen livestock, or hire trackers. Escape would involve changing routes and behavior rather than riding beyond a red circle. For a lawman protagonist, those systems could reverse. The player gathers testimony, follows tracks, compares ammunition, and decides when evidence is sufficient. Political pressure may demand an arrest before the facts are clear. A respected suspect can afford lawyers or armed allies. A poor suspect becomes convenient. Choosing to enforce the law quickly might protect a town while condemning an innocent person. Delaying for truth might allow a killer to leave. Investigation would become part of the moral world, rather than a detective minigame pasted onto it. Disguises and confidence schemes appear frequently in Hosea theories. Clothing, accent, forged documents, companions, and knowledge of local customs could determine whether a false identity survives. The player scouts a target, learns which story the target wants to believe, and prepares details that make the lie comfortable. Drawing a gun remains possible, but it means abandoning a plan built over several days. Robbery becomes social before it becomes physical. That style would broaden the meaning of outlaw. Western crime involved rustling, fraud, smuggling, train robbery, stage robbery, claim jumping, protection, and political corruption. Not only gunmen entering a bank through the front door. A cattle brand could be as important as a rifle. A telegram could destroy an alibi. Stealing payroll without killing anyone might require more preparation than wiping out a guard detail, while leaving subtler consequences in the town's economy. Gang leadership is another common prediction, especially for a young Dutch game or a new cast. RDR2 lets Arthur contribute money and supplies, but Dutch controls movement and purpose. A third game could place responsibility on the protagonist. Members need food, medical care, ammunition, privacy, and a reason to stay. Recruitment changes camp culture. A skilled gunman may frighten families. A charming fraud may bring money while quietly dividing loyalties. Growth would never be purely beneficial. Leadership choices should reach beyond selecting upgrades from a ledger. Who receives scarce medicine? Does the gang abandon an injured member when law approaches? Are stolen wages shared with workers or used to buy a safer hideout? Can someone leave with their portion of the money? Dutch's failure begins partly in his inability to imagine loyalty without obedience. A protagonist who allows departure may lose strength and preserve humanity. The camp becomes a moral system because people can say no. The most interesting version allows the gang to change shape rather than treating every recruit as permanent content. Some people leave if violence escalates. Others stay only when money flows. Relationships form independently of the hero. A camp member may rescue another while the protagonist is away, creating loyalty that cannot be commanded. Death would not always come in a scripted mission. Illness, arrest, desertion, or betrayal could leave quieter, empty spaces. Such freedom would complicate a tightly written narrative. Rockstar's camp scenes work because every actor, line, and relationship can be arranged with precision. A fully simulated gang risks producing shallow procedural dialogue. The better compromise may be a fixed central cast surrounded by temporary followers whose outcomes respond to decisions. The story keeps author depth while camp life gains uncertainty. Building a settlement instead of a gang offers another path. The epilogue of RDR2 makes construction memorable because a home represents John's attempt to become someone else. A future game could expand that idea through a town, refuge, ranch, or trading post. Buildings exist because named people need them. A school changes children's futures. A clinic draws a doctor with a hidden past. A saloon brings income and conflict. The place develops character through residence rather than decoration. This theory suits a protagonist trying to leave crime. Early robberies finance construction, creating a contradiction that becomes harder to ignore. The home is built with money taken from other homes. As the settlement grows, law and commerce arrive. The hero must decide whether safety means accepting the same institutions once resisted. Redemption may require surrendering control over the place, so it can live without becoming another Dutch-style kingdom centered on one personality. Property ownership appears in less narrative versions of the same idea. Fans want ranches, businesses, custom camps, and expanded horse breeding. These features can deepen attachment, but they can also turn a dying frontier into a wealth simulator. Arthur carrying thousands of dollars, while camp arguments insist that the gang needs money already, creates tension between system and story. A third game should make accumulated wealth socially meaningful. Land attracts taxes, thieves, labor disputes, and political attention. Ownership creates roots and therefore creates vulnerability. Horse systems inspire their own cluster of predictions. Bloodlines, training, temperament, injury, aging, and breeding could make horses feel less interchangeable. A mount raised from a foal would carry years of memory, while a stolen warhorse might remain difficult around gunfire for reasons discovered through care. A trader protagonist could move herds across the map, combining travel with weather, rustlers, disease, and negotiation. Yet deeper realism should not bury affection beneath chores. The bond matters more than a table of genetic traits. Wildlife could change with settlement and hunting pressure. RDR2 already shows an ecological attentiveness rare in open worlds, from scavengers gathering around carcasses to animals behaving differently across habitats. An earlier game might begin with immense herds and visibly reduce them as rail access and commercial hunting expand. The protagonist could profit from that destruction before understanding its scale. A later chapter, crossing the same plain, would find silence where movement once covered the horizon. That image would be historically and emotionally strong, especially in a Rains Fall or New Cast story. It would also need restraint. A simple conservation meter would reduce a vast political history to personal virtue. One hunter cannot reverse industrial demand or government policy. The game can still let choices matter locally, protecting a migration route, refusing a contract, exposing poisoned water, or helping a community relocate food stores. Meaning does not require pretending the hero controls the century. Weather theories move beyond prettier storms. Snow could close passes, drought could alter animal routes, rivers could flood, and fire could permanently change sections of forest. Seasonal movement would make camp location practical rather than cosmetic. A gang remains too long and exhausts nearby game. A settlement needs winter supplies. A bounty target waits for a frozen river to become passable. The world would demand planning without turning every journey into survival maintenance. Deadeye raises a quieter lore question. Is it merely a visual expression of exceptional focus, Or does the Red Dead world allow heroes a nearly supernatural relationship with time? Most theories treat it as style rather than magic. Different protagonists could experience it differently. Landon sees precise targets, Hosea anticipates movement through observation, and an inexperienced civilian feels panic stretch a second into fragments. The mechanic becomes character without requiring an ancient power or laboratory explanation. Fans sometimes push further and connect Deadeye to the strange man. Perhaps every Red Dead protagonist is marked by death, able to slow the moment because their fate is already being watched. There is no canonical basis for that system. It belongs to the same imaginative space as theories that the honor animals are spiritual guides. The games use symbolic and supernatural imagery freely, but symbolism need not become a rulebook. The strange man himself is almost certain to appear in discussion of any future game, even if he never returns. He confronts John with knowledge no ordinary stranger should possess, tests moral behavior, predicts death, and remains unharmed when John fires at him. RDR2 deepens the mystery through a changing cabin, a portrait, writings, and the figure reflected behind the player. Dan Houser has described him in terms of a shadow, karma, or the devil rather than supplying a single literal identity. One theory makes the strange man the connective tissue of the entire series. He appears to each protagonist at a moral turning point, perhaps under different names and clothing. He never causes the tragedy. He observes whether someone recognizes what they have become. In a third game, an earlier encounter could imply that his interest in John began before John was born. A protagonist might save or condemn a young member of the Marston family, placing another debt on the ledger the strange man seems to carry. Making him the central villain would be a mistake. The force pursuing Red Dead's heroes is not a supernatural mastermind. It is history, violence, appetite, and the stories people tell to avoid responsibility. If the strange man arranged every death, Dutch and Ross would become pieces on someone else's board. His power comes from arriving after choices have already exposed the person making them. He is a witness nobody can lie to, not a final boss waiting for special ammunition. Some proposals make him playable, telling the origin of a mortal man who becomes death's agent. That would trade mystery for mythology. We would learn his name, wound, transformation, and rules. Perhaps such a story could work as gothic folklore, but every answer would reduce the unease of finding him beside an empty road. The strange man should know the protagonist. The protagonist should never know him. Other supernatural theories gather around existing mysteries: the time traveler Francis Sinclair, the panoramic map, the pagan ritual, the giant skeletons, the ghost of Agnes Dowd, the vampire in Saint Denis, and strange lights in the sky. A third game might connect these clues into one hidden cosmology. Francis could travel to another Western decade. Alien visitors could explain technology beyond its period. A secret cult could link cabins across all maps. The evidence points instead toward a world containing many kinds of mystery, without one master solution. Agnes is a local tragedy. Francis is a playful science fiction intrusion. The vampire may be a murderer performing an identity, or something genuinely unnatural. The UFO rewards curiosity rather than advancing Arthur's plot. Their independence makes the world feel bottomless. Combining them into a single conspiracy would make it smaller, like discovering that every strange sound in the woods came from one machine. Gavin's disappearance has also been recruited into RDR3 theories. Perhaps the next protagonist is Gavin. Perhaps Nigel has invented him. Or perhaps a time travel plot will finally deliver the missing friend. Nothing about the encounter suggests it was planted as a lead for another 60-hour story. Its charm comes from repetition, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable possibility that the search is all Nigel has left. A future cameo could continue the joke, but a definitive answer would probably be less memorable than the question. Undead Nightmare occupies a separate branch of Desire. Fans asking for another supernatural western often say RDR3 when they really mean they want Rockstar to return to the freedom of that expansion. A new plague could emerge during RDR2, in the gang's early years, or after Jack's revenge. Vampires, aliens, Wendigo legends, or a frozen horror in the north replace zombies in some pitches. The appeal is not canon. It is seeing serious characters confront an impossible genre without losing their personalities. An Undead Nightmare 2 would work best as a deliberately non-canonical companion, not the foundation of the next numbered game. Arthur facing a supernatural outbreak could revive dead gang members, transform familiar towns, and let Rockstar exaggerate every eerie corner of the map. A Landon Ricketts monster story could turn dime novel legend into literal adventure. Because the expansion sits outside the main tragedy, it can be playful without explaining the strange man or changing anyone's real death. The shared universe theory with Grand Theft Auto is more persistent. Fans point to the Jack Marston book, familiar surnames, matching companies, weapons, and scattered Red Dead references in modern Los Santos. They imagine descendants of old characters, surviving fortunes, or a historical map that eventually becomes San Andreas. Rockstar clearly enjoys these echoes. They reward people who know both series and make fictional brands feel like private jokes passed between developers. Literal continuity is harder to defend. Red Dead characters refer to real American places that Grand Theft Auto replaces with fictional equivalents. Geography, institutions, and public history do not align cleanly. Repeated names can be Easter eggs rather than genealogy. A third game might include another modern-facing reference, but a mission revealing that the Van der Linde money founded a GTA corporation would attach two worlds at the cost of each one's tone. Red Dead does not need Los Santos waiting in its future to make industrial modernity frightening. Another crossover theory invokes Bully, with family names or school records linking characters across decades. The same caution applies. Rockstar's catalogue behaves like a shelf of stories whose authors borrow props from one another. Similar objects do not require one continuous physical room. Treating every reference as evidence produces elaborate family trees built from jokes. They can be fun, but they are not reliable predictions. The Blackwater money inspires a more grounded continuation. Dutch retrieves or knows the location of the hidden fortune by 1907, and the money is eventually taken after his death. Fans wonder whether a third game could follow the cash backward, who supplied the ferry payroll, whether the robbery was a setup, and whether Micah had information before the Pinkertons claim he became an informant. Some theories make the fortune the property of a larger criminal network or industrial interest. RDR2 establishes that Micah began cooperating after Guarma, not before Blackwater, at least according to Milton. That does not make Micah innocent of manipulating the ferry job. He may have been reckless, ambitious, or privately informed without serving the Pinkertons. The law's fast response could reflect surveillance and the growing power of agencies rather than a secret traitor. A conspiracy is not necessary when the gang has become famous, noisy, and predictable. The idea that Blackwater was deliberately arranged to destroy Dutch is tempting because it turns disaster into design. Cornwall, the Pinkertons, a rival gang, or a corrupt official could have planted the opportunity. But Dutch's tragedy becomes weaker if an invisible mastermind causes his failure. The ferry job matters because his judgment, pride, and appetite meet a world capable of punishing them. He can be trapped without being innocent. A third game should resist the comfort of proving that someone else made every bad decision. Micah as protagonist is a theory mostly raised for provocation. His life before Dutch is obscure enough to support a Western crime story, and his brother Amos apparently abandoned violence and formed a family. That contrast could reveal a moment when Micah also had a path away. He chooses domination, cruelty, and survival instead. Like Lyle, he might lead an anti-redemption story in which every opportunity to change is rejected. Spending an entire game inside Micah's contempt would be exhausting. RDR2 uses him effectively because his presence changes the temperature of scenes without asking us to mistake corrosive confidence for depth. A short chapter from his view could show how he studies Dutch and resents Arthur. A full campaign might over-explain a man whose moral clarity lies in how little excuse the story grants him. His brother Amos is actually the more intriguing lead, a former violent man who escapes, builds a family, and lives under fear that Micah may find him. Agent Milton receives a similar lawside theory. He believes the age of outlaws is ending, and treats the gang as a disease to be removed. A game about his rise could show private detective work, strike breaking, corporate contracts, and the moment law enforcement becomes indistinguishable from hired power. He might begin with legitimate cases before accepting that employers value results more than justice. His path ends without redemption in Abigail's gunshot, but another agent could witness the same institution and choose differently. A Pinkerton-style protagonist would connect Red Dead to real Western labor history. Private detectives protected railways, pursued outlaws, infiltrated organizations, and worked against strikers. The hero could hunt a violent gang in one chapter and intimidate workers in the next, gradually recognizing that legality follows whoever pays the invoice. Unlike a sheriff tied to one town, an agency operative can travel across the whole map while carrying official permission to cross boundaries. The challenge is avoiding a simple conversion where the agent quits, puts on an outlaw coat, and immediately becomes good. People harmed during earlier work would not owe trust. Confidential records, informants, and institutional habits would follow him. Redemption might require releasing evidence that destroys his own safety or protecting someone he once marked for arrest. This character could intersect with young Dutch without joining him, showing why Dutch's criticism of power once sounded true. Arthur's lost family, Eliza and Isaac, sometimes appears in prequel pitches. Arthur tells Rain's Fall that Eliza was a young waitress and Isaac was their son. He visited when he could, until both were killed during a robbery for a small amount of money. Their deaths deepen his belief that attachment creates targets. A game could show this period and the younger Arthur moving between fatherhood and gang duty. The material is emotionally important and poorly suited to becoming a mystery box. We know the outcome, and centering the story on identifying the killers would turn private grief into another revenge plot. Eliza deserves more than existing to die in Arthur's origin. Her life, work, anger at Arthur's absences, and hopes for Isaac would need room. Even then, using her tragedy as the climax of another game risks exploiting a memory that RDR2 handles with rare restraint. A smaller appearance within a gang prequel might be enough. Arthur visits a modest home, tries awkwardly to be present, and leaves because Dutch needs him. Nothing dramatic occurs. The tragedy remains off-screen or reaches Arthur after it happens, as described. We would understand that his greatest failure was not losing a gunfight. It was repeatedly treating time with his son as something he could return to later. That knowledge could deepen Arthur without rewriting his completed arc. Mary Linton is occasionally proposed as a frame for young Arthur, perhaps reading his journal after his death or recalling their relationship. She possesses emotional access to a life outside the gang, but she cannot plausibly narrate events she never saw. A frame built around Arthur's journal would also face the question of how it survives. John receives the journal, and its ultimate fate remains unknown. Jack, as an older writer, is the more coherent keeper of those pages. The journal itself suggests another structural theory. The next game could be narrated retrospectively. An older survivor tells the story, and differences between narration and action reveal unreliable memory. Landon might polish his legend. Jack might reconstruct Arthur from incomplete pages, or an unknown outlaw might confess to a priest, reporter, or child. Red Dead already cares about how stories outlive people. A narrator could make that concern explicit without becoming a constant voice over every ride. Reliability would need to remain subtle. Replaying missions in wildly different versions could feel clever, but distance us from consequence. Small contradictions are stronger. A narrator insists he never feared a man while his hand shook in the scene. A newspaper uses heroic language for an ugly ambush. A companion remembers mercy the player did not choose. History becomes an argument among imperfect witnesses. Online speculation sits beside story theory, although the future of Red Dead Online has made fans cautious. Some imagine a third game's online world receiving years of properties, heists, roles, ranching, and cooperative gang systems. Others fear that online priorities would thin the single-player story, or make every system serve monetization. Rockstar's continuing Red Dead Online events show that the world remains active, but they do not announce the scale or design of any future mode. A richer cooperative frontier could be compelling if separated from the campaign. Players might form temporary posses, operate ranches, guide caravans, track bounties, or build small settlements. Dynamic lore and reputation would make roles interact, yet the central appeal of redemption is authored intimacy. No online economy can substitute for a quiet conversation with a person whose fate has been written carefully. The existence of one should not be treated as proof that the other must shrink. The development rumors become less romantic and more repetitive. A professional profile once mentioning an unidentified project is presented as a leak. A job listing requesting open-world experience becomes evidence that a Western map is underway. A supposed insider names a year far enough away that failure will be forgotten. Images circulate with the typography of a Rockstar announcement, but no source path leading back to Rockstar. Each rumor benefits from the company's silence. One sensible possibility is that ideas exist in some form. Studios of Rockstar's size do not need to finish one thought before anyone discusses the next. Writers, artists, technical teams and executives can explore concepts while the majority of production remains elsewhere. Red Dead Redemption 2 itself grew from ideas considered around the earlier game. Concept work is not the same as a game entering full production, and full production is not the same as a public release plan. Grand Theft Auto 6 dominates every reasonable schedule theory. Rockstar's official communications are focused on that launch, currently set for November 19th, 2026, along with the enormous work likely to follow it. That does not create a countdown to Red Dead. Teams can overlap, technology can transfer, and plans can change. Anyone naming an exact RDR3 year is stacking assumptions about staffing, scope, corporate priorities, and development time that the public cannot verify. The long production of RDR2 encourages estimates deep into the next decade. Such guesses may eventually look accurate because the window is broad, not because the source knew anything. A third game of equal or greater ambition would require years. It might also be smaller, structured differently, or developed after major changes in tools. Release arithmetic cannot reveal a project whose starting point is unknown. Take-Two's descriptions of Red Dead as a lasting franchise support eventual continuation more than immediate production. Sales demonstrate demand. Re-releases preserve access. Online events keep the brand visible. None of those actions chooses Red Dead as the next giant Rockstar project. A publisher can consider a franchise permanent while allowing a long distance between installments. The first redemption arrived in 2010, the second in 2018, and the conditions around a third are different again. Dan Houser's departure creates the largest creative uncertainty. He was not the only writer, director, or mind behind Red Dead, and reducing thousands of people's work to one author would be unfair. Rockstar retains artists, designers, performers, producers, and institutional experience capable of new work. Still, another team continuing a story he regards as cohesive would need to find its own reason. Perfect imitation would create a beautiful echo with no new voice. That may be why a new cast is safer creatively than a direct continuation. It allows current writers to define their own relationships and moral questions while remaining inside the Western world Rockstar built. Arthur and John can be respected as completed lives rather than tests the new game must pass. The next protagonist would not need to sound like either man. They could be more educated, more frightened, more political, less competent, older, younger, or rooted in a community the earlier games barely saw. After all these trails, the theories can finally be weighed without pretending certainty. A Jack sequel offers the strongest direct continuation and the weakest claim to being a traditional Western. It could complete the family's cycle, particularly if Jack refuses another act of revenge. But every year after 1914 changes the genre around him. His best future may remain the unwritten one in which he puts the gun down and turns memory into words. Sadie and Charles possess open endings, natural abilities, and affections strong enough to carry a game. Both also leave RDR2 moving toward lives beyond the gang. Returning them to constant violence requires a reason better than popularity. Sadie, in a precisely researched South American setting, could make a sharp spin-off. Charles protecting a northern community could produce a quieter, more collective story. Neither needs to be called Redemption 3 to matter. Hosea has the richest established bridge into another country and the most fixed decline. His revolutionary youth could be vivid, while his service to Allende gives the tale a bitter destination. A game about him would explain loyalty, but perhaps too thoroughly. Bill and Micah are even less suited to long redemption arcs. Watching a person become the antagonist we remember can be powerful for a chapter and airless for an entire world. Mac Callender is the cleanest fan service protagonist. He is close enough to the gang to unlock camp life, unknown enough to surprise us, and doomed in a way that matches the series. Blackwater supplies an enormous climax. The theory's weakness is exactly the same closeness. It leaves almost no epilogue, repeats the gang's late decline, and turns the second game's carefully obscured disaster into a level that may never equal its reputation. Landon Ricketts is the strongest familiar character for a true Golden Age Western. He can cross decades, landscapes, and legends without living under Dutch's tent. His survival invites a different kind of redemption, one carried through old age. The writers would have to invent the central moral wound, but invention is not a flaw when the existing outline leaves room. He could connect the old world to Blackwater while never revealing everything. Rain's Fall holds the greatest thematic possibility and the greatest responsibility. His earlier anger, losses, and movement toward preservation create a real arc. Centering indigenous experience would expose the foundation beneath Western freedom. It would also demand specificity, collaboration, and honesty beyond what a familiar outlaw adventure requires. If approached with that depth, it could become the most important story the series has attempted. If approached as scenery for solemn speeches, it should not be attempted at all. Young Hosea, Dutch, and Arthur promise the warmest camp and the heaviest dramatic irony. Seeing the gang's generosity would make its ruin hurt again. Yet 20 years of history resist one campaign, and Dutch's mystery may be more valuable than his answers. A founding story works best through somebody near them, not inside Dutch's private mind, and it should end before every remembered anecdote has been turned into a mission. Red Harlow belongs to myth, where he remains wonderfully flexible. Black Bell could carry a lively gunslinger epic without needing to die. An O'Driscoll viewpoint could make the familiar gang strange. Lyle Morgan is better left in Arthur's shadow. Agent Milton's world could support a law and corporation story, though another operative would offer more moral freedom. Each is possible. None feels as spacious as a person we have never met. The most convincing overall theory is therefore not the one with the most clues. It is a new protagonist in an earlier Western decade, on a mostly new map, with restrained connections to the redemption saga. The late 1870s or 1880s would restore cattle trails, rough settlements, territorial conflict, and rapid industrial expansion. A Western or Pacific region could provide landscapes distinct from Lemoyne and New Hanover. Mexico, or one familiar state, could sit at the edge, giving recognition without controlling the journey. The protagonist might be a former lawman, soldier, drover, outlaw, or member of a community pushed aside by expansion. The exact identity matters less than the moral design. Their central wrong should be specific. Their relationships should exist beyond a gang leader's approval. Redemption should require surrendering something they genuinely value, not only shooting the correct villain. Survival should remain possible, because the series can honor sacrifice without making death the admission price for change. Dutch's gang could pass through once. Perhaps the protagonist meets Hosea during a fraud, hears Arthur's name as a boy newly taken in, or witnesses Dutch perform a generosity that is entirely sincere. Nothing in the meeting needs to announce future tragedy. Years later, a newspaper mentions the Blackwater Massacre, and people around a table disagree about whether Dutch was a hero, murderer, or fool. The old story becomes part of history rather than the center of the world. The strange man might wait on a road, but he would offer no law lecture. A Red Harlow tale might be heard beside a fire. Landon could appear in a chapter where his public legend conflicts with his exhausted private self. Black Bell might cross the map without joining the permanent cast. These encounters would reward memory while leaving space between lives. The West becomes large enough to hold several legends that do not all share a family tree. The ending should resist the temptation to ride directly into another game's opening. A final shot of the Blackwater ferry would produce instant recognition and little surprise. A stronger ending would complete the new hero's promise. Maybe a community survives while the hero's name is forgotten. Maybe a lawman confesses and lives without a badge. Maybe an outlaw gives away land that took a lifetime to acquire. A newspaper could get the story wrong the next morning, and the world would continue. That is the quality every worthy theory is reaching for beneath its favorite name. People want another Red Dead because these games make endings feel larger than death. Arthur dies, but John reaches his family. John dies, but Jack carries his name. The gang disappears, yet empty camps remain where laughter once moved through the trees. Another game does not need to reopen those graves. It needs to find another life capable of leaving that kind of silence behind. For now, Red Dead Redemption 3 remains a country made entirely from possibility. On one road, Jack crosses into Mexico with Ross's blood still fresh in memory. On another, Sadie boards a ship south, while Charles follows Winter toward a home in Canada. Mac Callender lies wounded outside Blackwater. Landon Ricketts rides before his name becomes legend. A young Rains Fall looks across land the government has already begun measuring. Hosea and Dutch sit at their first campfire, amused by the failed robbery that introduced them, unable to imagine how far their friendship will carry so many other people. Beyond those familiar figures, someone without a name rides through a region we have never seen. The railway has not reached the valley yet. A mining camp shines against a dark slope. Farther west, fog gathers among trees older than any border. A family waits at a ranch that may not survive the decade. A deputy folds a warrant he no longer believes in. An outlaw counts money that cannot buy what was lost. Any one of them could be the beginning. Until Rockstar chooses, no theory owns the trail. The confident leaks will continue to arrive and disappear. Fan maps will keep stretching toward the Pacific. Actors will be placed in imaginary casts because they looked right beneath a hat. Every mention of a ranch, brother, gunfight, or destination will be examined for an intention it may never have carried. That restless attention is not only impatience, it is evidence that the first two games made their world feel as though life continued beyond the camera. And perhaps that is the most honest ending available tonight. There is no secret trailer waiting inside a cabin, no release year hidden in the stars, and no single Reddit post that solved a game before it was announced. There are only stories trying to find the shape of another story. Some follow bloodlines. Some follow geography. Some protect old characters, while others ask to be surprised. The best of them understand that Red Dead is not held together by hats, horses, or the color of its sunsets. It is held together by people realizing that the story they used to justify their lives has stopped being true. The fire has settled lower now. The roads beyond camp can return to darkness, each one still carrying its unwritten rider. Blackwater can keep the parts of its night that nobody has earned the right to see. Jack can remain somewhere beyond the river, with a gun in one possible future and a pen in another. Sadie and Charles can keep traveling toward lives that do not need our witness. The old gunslingers can argue inside their legends, and the new ones can wait without names. Whenever the next Red Dead finally arrives, much of what has been imagined will vanish in a moment. One map will replace 100 handmade maps. One face will occupy the space where Mac, Landon, Rains Fall, Jack, and strangers all stood together. That loss will be part of the excitement. Possibility has to narrow before a story can begin. Until then, the whole frontier belongs to speculation, quiet and enormous beneath the night. So let the horses stand easy. Let the last coals dim without another plan being announced around them. The age of the West may be over inside the story, but somewhere outside it, a first morning is still waiting. A rider will wake, gather a coat, check a worn weapon, and step into a world that does not yet know what name it will remember. We can leave that morning untouched for now, beyond the ridge, while the camp grows still and the long imagined country finally rests.